Good evening and welcome again to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm your host, Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. And tonight, my guest is former communications professional and current independent journalist, Zeynab Day. How are you doing, Zainab?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Oh, well, I went back to work today after a prolonged weekend, using up that vacation time before the end of the year. And
Nice.
so it's Monday for me.
Just your
But
typical Monday. Yeah.
it's all. But it's not. It's Tuesday, which means the week is one day shorter, which is nice. It's not just that you have an extra day off. It also means you're on your break again that much sooner.
True.
And of course, I had time to do stuff at home. We were able to talk about we were able to participate in Renee Johnston's town hall for Stop Cop City. That was good. I wouldn't have been able to do that without the little vacation.
Yeah,
Um,
that was one of the best panels I've seen in a while on this subject. It was that was a powerful thing to watch. I think everyone should check that out.
oh, I definitely agree. Kamau Franklin, who did a lot of speaking, is one of the organizers to Stop Cop City there in Atlanta, and they got attacked today in the park. The cops were tear gassing folks in the very woods that they want to tear down to build the training center.
That's insane.
It really is. They
I
were.
mean, not shocking, but insane.
Oh, well, I mean, I wish I could pretend to be shocked by a lot of this stuff anymore. But at the same time, it is actually shocking in the sense that people should be shocked by this. We shouldn't expect this to be normal. The fact that we do consider this on some level to be normal says more about us than it does about, oh, this is just ordinary stuff. No, it's still shocking stuff. It's just that we live in a society that's making us numb to it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean the levels of militarization of our police. I remember on the panel they were talking about how there's going to be a massive helipad for
for
like
Black
Black
Hawk,
Hawks. Yeah, for Black Hawk helicopters. Why do we need
well, so
Black, Black
that
Hawk helicopters
means,
are designed so that soldiers can be hanging out of it with turrets and guns. That's the
oh, yeah,
whole
it's specifically, it's good sometimes to be interested in military history sometimes too. Specifically, Black Hawk was what was used in Vietnam to take people into and out of combat.
That's right.
So the only reason that the Atlanta Police Department would need Black Hawk helicopters is if they were planning to take something like a SWAT team by air into what they considered to be a combat situation and then come back and pick them up in the middle of a firefight potentially.
Yeah, it's insane.
That's what you use Black Hawk helicopters for, picking up and dropping people off in combat situations.
Right. Right. And the amount of, I don't know how packed out these helicopters are going to be, but the amount of weapons that have been developed for Black Hawk specifically. I mean, you have the massive gun turrets on the front. And as I was saying, you have the ability, literally tactical ability for gunmen to hang off of the helicopter
Yep.
and shoot directly from outside, sniper style from outside the
Yeah.
helicopter. That's just insane to me. What would be the point in having a helipad big enough? But as they had mentioned on the panel, it's this base is actually surrounded by military bases in Georgia. And so the local police are literally working with the military, and so it's quite a literal militarization of the police force.
And just as a sort of aside, they don't even necessarily have to get the helicopters from the federal government directly. You remember how they were talking about police foundations getting private money and using that to buy stuff. So I was reading today, just on a lark, I typed into the Google, where would cops buy a Black Hawk helicopter? And one of the things that came up was, oh, look, the Pentagon is selling a surplus Black Hawk in New Mexico today. Just inviting the people who would be invited and auctioning it off, basically.
Who are they auctioning it off to? To police forces?
Who knows? Whoever's bidding, I guess. That's a very good question.
That should not be legal. Our tax dollars paid for that. Our government shouldn't, I would say that the average American would say destroy it before selling it off to privatized companies or who knows where.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I imagine Academy still needs helicopters. They used to go by Blackwater. They changed their name a couple of times in order to sound less notorious. And now they're Academy with an I.
Oh, that's right.
Like they were some sort of for-profit college or something. But no, their product is worse.
It's not shocking. Blackwater was involved in, ironically, Black Hawk Down and what went on during the Clinton administration, our covert efforts. Was that in Croatia? Is that where that was?
Well, Black Hawk Down was Somalia.
Somalia, that's right. Thank you. Because that same I guess a year and a half later, we had all the issues in Croatia that were very similar and paralleled what was going on in Somalia in some ways.
Well, it's hard to know exactly what was going on in Somalia. And the reason I say that is because all our media gave us very specific propaganda designed to make it sound as bad as possible. And sure,
true,
it sounds bad, but if we're also talking about things that sound bad, well, I could say, and not be completely lying, that South Central Los Angeles has been divvied up by warlords who have their own territory, which they protect violently in order to maintain very strict control over specific shadow economies. So when you say it like that, all of a sudden Los Angeles sounds like Somalia.
Right. Well, it's always propagandized that other governments, other entities are so that we're above them somehow. You've got this whole concept that I grew up with of the banana republic. Yes. That I learned the older and older I get was completely
the banana republic was set up by the United States for the benefit of the United States.
That's right.
The banana republics were sponsored by Chiquita, which used to call itself the United Fruit Company.
And we, the way that it's colonialism, essentially. I mean, it's the same type of propaganda that we saw when the mining companies and the lumber companies and they started migrating here into the United States before we existed, when they were building the colonies. It's the same kind of propaganda about, Native Americans being savages. It's no different. It's all colonialism.
I live in Oregon, and of course, Oregon is a big lumber state. So there are places you go up here that, of course, state parks, national parks, what have you. And they're, of course, wilderness, whatever. But you go through some forests that are owned, that aren't part of the state or national park system, and you see these little, I'm trying to think of the right way to explain it. you see these little signs sort of sticking up out of the ground near the trees and hanging off the trees. And they're usually the name of a lumber / paper company. Weyerhaeuser's a big one. But it's all the same thing. Those trees were planted by that company to replace trees they cut down before, and they belong to that company who will then cut them down and plant more trees.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, they only plant more trees because they were legally forced to. And it's important to understand that corporations don't do anything unless they're legally forced. And hello, Renee. I'm so glad you could join us.
Awesome panel. We were just talking about how informative and amazing it was, and how everyone needs to know about Cop City being built in Atlanta.
And also that a protest there in the woods was attacked by the cops with tear gas today, which is depressing. But I mean, that's what it takes to enforce the law and protect property in a society where we negotiate a compromise to prevent a labor strike. But if Iran did it, the news would be saying, well, they made it illegal to try to unionize the railroads. Which, I mean, it's bad when other countries do it too. I'm not trying to say that other countries don't ever actually do bad things. But imagine if we talked about what our country does, the way our media talks about what other countries do.
Yeah, if our mainstream media presented it the same way, it would be like, have you ever watched Drunk History on Comedy Central? I love that. I love to try to boil down anything I'm talking about political to like drunk history style. Because what's intriguing about the show is it kind of washes away oftentimes the colonial umbrella that everything is under, the American exceptionalism, and really gets to the heart of the nitty gritty of what's going on. And our media does portray the United States the same exact things that we do here. I'm Iranian, and we've talked about Iran on your show before, but the protests over there are authentic.
Yes.
But you have the media split here where some are like, oh, they're trying to do a color revolution. And then others are like, they need our help. They need, intervention, more sanctions, as if sanctions are helping the people. They're not. And so the whole view, though, about the police being brutal and about police brutality and about arrest and about detaining people, I can relate and empathize in a deep way because we have similar problems here with our labor force, with our rights, especially women's rights being oppressed, with the militarized police force.
If you look at the way our cops act in Black communities or brown communities, you get something really close to the way the religious police act in Saudi Arabia or Iran, or the way the IDF acts in Palestinian territories in the Middle East. It's not a thin line. It's not a wide gulf. It's really, all this stuff is really close together. The same sets of problems. We taught the Israelis all the counterinsurgency stuff that we learned in Vietnam. And now the Israelis teach their version, their improvements on all that stuff back to our cops to use it against civilians here in the U.S.
We need to stop considering the police force that we currently have as being something different than our militarized force.
Yes.
Or even our National Guard. Our police, some police forces are armed more than our National Guard.
I'll actually even take it a step further, and I will say, the National Guard is out there rescuing people in disasters a lot of the time, and putting up sandbags and doing lots of necessary things that you'll never ever see a cop do.
True. The National Guard, and even a lot of times the Coast Guard, do more public service than our police forces do.
Well, the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard is my favorite story. The Coast Guard are a specialized kind of cop. The Coast Guard are like the Border Patrol, but for the water. And
they're corrupt. Don't get me wrong, but
the whole point of the Coast Guard, as envisioned by Alexander Hamilton, who's the reason they're part of the Treasury and not part of the Navy, say.
Alexander Hamilton. Yeah.
But the Coast Guard was supposed to stop smuggling. It was supposed to stop people from sneaking into the United States who didn't belong here. Or who did belong here, but who weren't supposed to bring their stuff in without paying to do so.
Right.
And so as a result, the Coast Guard is actually more of a sort of civilian security. Also, there's the whole thing at sea, where at sea, the rules are you help people in trouble no matter what. And the Coast Guard is supposed to also follow that rule and help people at sea if they're in trouble. You don't have that with the cops.
No.
There's not a good Samaritan rule that requires cops to help people. There's no law of the sea that requires cops to intervene if people need to be saved.
Well, I saw a video not too long ago, and a guy got a ticket because his car stalled out, and dude was frustrated, man. And he said, "Can you fucking help me push it out of the road? Can you at least help me push it out of the road? You're going to ticket me because my car stalled. I can't." They're like, "We're going to have come and have it towed." He's like, "I can't fucking afford a tow truck. Don't tow it. Push it out of the road. That way I can work on it and figure out what's wrong." And he was so upset, and everyone felt it. I mean, he was like, "Man, just fucking help me push it then. Why are you giving me a ticket?" And they're like, "We can't touch your property, sir." And it's like, are you serious? Then you need to take protect and serve out of this. You need to take protect and serve out of this because you're not doing either one.
Like the cops have ever been embarrassed about touching other people's property.
Right? Asset forfeiture is how they sustain themselves.
Well, so I have to say this. I mean, it's not even just people they're investigating or people they know are drug dealers, but they can't arrest them. It's not just things like that anymore. The Canadian government issued travel warnings to Canadian tourists planning to travel in America, saying, make sure you take credit cards or debit cards or traveler's checks. Whatever you do, do not take cash into the United States. The American cops will rob you.
That's hilarious and sad.
It's both. But think about it.
There was something that really stuck out to me that Renee mentioned. And it goes back to, with domestic violence situations, for instance, when I was a domestic violence or domestic survivor advocate, we would often say, really weary about filing an EPO because it doesn't actually protect anyone. We were very weary of calling the police for help because the police would often side with the perpetrator and not with, the person being abused. And on top of that, if someone files a complaint, if someone files a police report about rape, only 1.9% of those ever get prosecuted. It's the same that Renee had said with violent crimes.
Yeah.
Only 20% of those ever lead to any type of investigation where they begin to arrest somebody. But after that, only, what was it, 9% lead to convictions. So what's the other 91% of what the police
worse when you start to get into violent crime. It's like only 2% of
crime
violent crime is solved.
Yeah. So what are they doing? They're not preventing violence. They're not. What are they, just stopping drugs? Is that they're stopping drugs? They're giving, parking tickets. And especially, let's talk about white collar crime.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a whole worksheet.
White collar crime is one of the reasons that we have such a massive wealth gap in this country. It's the robbing of workers, and some of this, a lot of this, such as workers' rights. Let's see, theft just from companies, theft, tax evasion, all kinds of different types of theft.
Wage theft.
Wage theft, definitely. But there's illegal theft that's going on, and white collar crimes.
Well, I'm not even talking about
$5 million and never get jailed for it.
But that's the thing, is I'm not even talking about all the legal ways they steal your wages. Literally, there are companies illegally stealing your wages as we speak. The last place I worked before my current job, they switched to making all their employees sign promises not to sue the company and to take stuff to through company approved arbitration channels instead. Because every year from the time I worked there to a couple years after they made us sign the change in policy, there was a class action suit every year over wage theft, and they kept losing every time. The reason they changed the rules is because they were having to pay out so many awards to people who sued them.
That's insane. There's you have the temp agencies too. Similar to what you're talking about. You have temp agencies that will take 30 to 60% of your wages.
Yep.
And that's to help companies avoid things like having to pay workers comp insurance and having to claim that these are employees, so then they have to follow employee laws. But 60 to 40% of your wages, or 40 to 60% of your wages, just go to that company instead of, so the company that you are employed to you're not employed to temporary work at, but the place that you're temporarily working. Let's say it's a shoe manufacturer, right? And you go to a place called the job store. And you've seen the advertisements for it on the billboards and the buses, and on TV saying, go here, we'll hire you out somewhere, $16 an hour. And you get the job, and they outsource you basically to this shoe company, but the shoe company is paying $35 an hour for that position. So the company is paying the money, then that temp agency gets it.
Well,
and that's so that company, it's beneficial to that company because they can skirt the labor laws then.
Well, the last place I worked,
$22 and giving them benefits, they'd rather pay $35 and go through the temp agency. So sorry, go ahead.
The last place I worked was an outsourced call center for bigger corporations. Now, what they did, the company that owned the call center, Xerox's biggest money now is what they call business services, which is things that they do for other companies, which they spun off into its own company, Conduit, which is bigger than Xerox now.
Oh, wow. I have Conduit with the little U with the two dots on top.
Conduit, yes. And it's just, it's just the whole business model is this outsourcing whereby company A pays Xerox to handle their technical support or their customer service or any number of a couple of things, sales, whatever. And Xerox takes that deal and hires so many people to fill those jobs. And Xerox is the employer. Xerox is responsible for their wages. Xerox is responsible for their benefits. The corporation hiring them is just paying a per head fee to Xerox for the workers doing the work. And Xerox takes that money and has to make it pay for wages and benefits. Now, obviously, when you look at it that way, obviously Xerox is going to pay lower wages and pay for crappier benefits than the parent company was, because they don't have the resources of the parent company. They're just getting what the parent company pays them.
True.
And so that whole business model is part of a race to the bottom.
Yeah,
and it used to be that happened in other countries. You sent that tech support department's jobs to India. Well, no. Now you just send that tech support department's job to another facility across town that's owned by a completely different company.
Yeah. And I mean, the money that is made, the money that is made in those companies is just it's mind-boggling, really. And to me, it's labor theft, and it should be illegal. And it used to be, but thanks to Reagan, those laws were repealed and then gutted further by Bill Clinton. And then when we repealed Glass-Steagall, they went completely out the window. And so there is no stopgap in this country to avoid this type of thing. I mean, you can think of it as like subletting jobs. You know?
It's like I think everybody can think, if they're honest with themselves, everybody can think of something that they really should be doing anyway, that they don't really gain anything by not doing, but the only reason they'll do it, the only way they'll do it, is if someone makes them or nags us or whatever. And a lot of people have something like that they just won't do unless someone actually makes them. For me,
it's laundry.
For me, I hate needles. I hate needles. If somebody wants me to get vaccinated, pass a law, mandate it. Otherwise, I'll make excuses. And, I'm just being honest about it. There are lots of people who won't be honest about these things.
True.
And that's why self-reporting only works if you trust people. And we cannot trust corporations to self-regulate and self-report because there's no incentive in it and no one making them do it.
It's like the cops investigating themselves. I mean, in all these situations, when you look at it, it's like when it comes to labor laws, like if it's sexual harassment, for instance, the workplace has to investigate internally themselves initially, and then you can file a report. But the report takes all this time, and in some states you can't file unless the place has 16 employees. It's all a big mess, and everywhere you look, over and over again, whether it's from our Congress to the police to corporations, there are stopgaps to protect those in power. And all of the red tape that's in place isn't to protect us. It's to protect those organizations, those places of power where they're accumulating massive wealth, or they have an overemphasized amount of control. It's in order to keep them protected. And it's not to our benefit at all. Although sometimes on the face it looks like these organizations are to our benefit, they're not.
People say things like, well, railroads are making record profits. They can afford to give people some sick days.
Yeah.
But then you think about it and then you say, but if railroads were giving people sick days, would they still be making record profits?
Yeah.
Well, but that's the thing. We don't know. And the way that the railroad people are thinking about it is, well, we can't give those sick days away. We may not be making profits like this next year. And it's
greed.
Exactly.
It's greed because, there used to be protections. For instance, there were prior to the tax laws that Reagan put into place in the 80s, and there was a lot of propaganda to cover it up. Working 9 to 5. You had all of that going on. You had that song is amazing. That song doesn't count.
Communist song.
Huh?
9 to 5 is a communist song about sticking it to the boss.
That's right.
It's also a feminist song about sexual harassment.
Yep. That's right. So, but we had a lot of propaganda, and that's why Dolly Parton wrote the song, was to combat the propaganda. It was sort of a joke to the propaganda. Exactly. But the propaganda was work your life away. And that's what she was talking about in the song. She was sticking it to the boss man. But the propaganda was work your life away. We saw all these, I remember seeing all these graphics and these images of the individual climbing the ladder and stepping over people, and everyone in business suits. And you saw those pictures of New York, was on the TV all the time, where everyone had their briefcases and their suits. There was a lot of propaganda, but that was because what had happened was it was the birth of the cubicle. And what had happened was prior to this, there were tax incentives in place. So it was de-incentivized for CEOs and managers to make, board of directors and even stockholders that owned a large portion of the stock to make outrageous salaries or outrageous profits, because those profits would be taxed a lot of times at 80 or 90% if they were making. It was factored in what the lowest person paid at that company, and their benefits weighed into that. So healthcare, that's why people had retirement and healthcare and 401ks, because all of those actually gave companies tax breaks back then. The CEO couldn't make, 2,000 times what their janitor's making. So the gap was, they were still very wealthy, but the gap wasn't as wide. They were paying those lower paid more so that they could make a little bit more, right?
Yes.
All of that was completely wiped away. And that's, that was never available to Black and brown Americans the way that it was for white Americans, but it was something that happened after the Great Depression. It was something that happened during the GI Bills, post World War II. And that's how the middle class was built. Not to mention also things like just paying your bills would allow you to have enough to have a good credit score to buy a home without a down payment.
Well, let's remember that. Let's remember that
credit cards. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Let's remember that I am older than credit scores. Now, mind you, I am not old enough that I was an adult when you could do these things without a credit score, but I was born before credit scores were born.
Mm-hmm. Same here.
So it's not prehistory. Credit scores are younger than me. ICE is younger than me. ICE is younger than my kid sister.
Yeah. The militarization of police is new, fairly new within the last 25 years.
Yes, and yet no. And
the way it is today is the to the extremity that it is new. It
It
used to
is.
be
They
less
didn't have
connected.
snakes.
There used to be less of an interconnected web between the FBI, the police force, and our military.
Well,
It existed, but it wasn't as strong as it is today.
so what I will say is this. During Prohibition, the 1920s, the Thompson machine gun, the Thompson submachine gun, which had been built for the purpose of issuing to American troops in World War One, began to be given to cops on the
That's right.
argument that they were outgunned by the gangsters who all had Tommy guns.
Right.
So these submachine guns that were military grade were somehow allegedly making their way among the gangsters, so the cops had to have them too.
Weren't they getting them from the cops though?
So this is worth a whole show on its own, but this is one of my favorite songs. The bank robbers of the 1920s got everything that they used to rob the rich from the rich. The very first robberies that the so-called First Dillinger Gang made after they got out of prison and started their crime wave. The very first thing that the First Dillinger Gang did was rob a big hardware store and steal all the guns. Because in those days, they sold rifles and handguns and even in some cases submachine guns at the hardware store. So they robbed a hardware store and took the guns. And then they used the guns they stole from the hardware store to rob a bank. It was all very, very planned. And so you knew you were going to steal your guns here so that the guns could only be traced back to where they were stolen from when you robbed the bank here. They never shot bank tellers or bank customers. The only people who were ever shot by members of Dillinger's gang were guards or cops. The only person John Dillinger ever killed was a cop who he shot while fleeing a bank. It's funny how you would think from the FBI story and similar movies that all these 1920 bank robbers were killing people left and right. But they weren't.
But somehow it kind of got through to people because they've always been glamorized a little bit. I mean, seen as like the Robin Hoods of the neighborhoods. And somehow that translated and has always historically translated. Similar to the Jesse Jameses and, what happened. And
there's a big difference between Jesse James and John Dillinger, and that is Jesse James robbed passengers. He only did it 2 or 3 times, but he robbed passengers on trains on at least 2 occasions. They robbed passengers on a stagecoach on at least 1 occasion because the money box was empty. And on 1 occasion, they actually had to rob bank customers because the bank had already sent all its cash.
Yep, I remember those stories, yeah.
And so those old-time gangsters, those old-time outlaws also, and this doesn't get talked about enough, those old-time outlaws were Confederates and pro-slavery men and just some of the worst people. And that's one of the reasons they were romanticized later, because you wanted to romanticize the worst people in order to romanticize the Confederacy in general.
That reminds me of a topic that we were going to talk about tonight, and that was yellow journalism.
Yes,
actually. Yeah, that reminds me of that a lot, because the pamphlets and everything that came out of the Wild West, that folks read.
The Bond novel.
And that was like the mid 1800s, social media,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it glorified, there was so much
And
propaganda in
and
it,
these
and it painted
completely
Native Americans as violent.
and
It glorified, as you said, the Confederates that were
all these
studied and
outlaws,
fled after the war to
yeah.
settle in the West, and it was
Almost
a glorification of colonialism,
there
essentially.
there are some exceptions, and those some of those exceptions are worth talking about. But a lot of the most famous outlaws were unreconstructed Confederates who were continuing to fight against emancipation, essentially, in their minds.
Yep.
John Wesley Hardin, one of the famous gunfighters of Texas, started his career killing black members of the Texas State Reconstruction Police that had been established to replace the Texas Rangers, who were outlawed as having been pro-Confederate, which they were. So during the Reconstruction, the Texas Rangers were criminalized, and the state police, who were given badges and guns, included a large number of freed slaves. And John Wesley Hardin's first famous gunfights were all with black cops, specifically black cops who were given guns to enforce the law against former Confederates.
Well, there's a movie that's loosely about that, and it's called Blazing Saddles.
Now, that is the best Western ever made. It is the most true Western ever made in so many ways. It does not, because it's such a broad farce, it makes a joke out of things, but it really expresses the racism of those days in a way that no other Western can.
It's true. It's definitely some of those old comedies are some of the truths. The producers was another one that was like way ahead of its time, I believe.
Well, yeah. Well, the writer is a Hitler fan who's hiding out from the Nazi hunters.
Mm-hmm. And people thought it was a joke, just like people think that some of the people that we have out there today are either harmless or that
everybody who thinks Mel Brooks was joking about racism or anti-Semitism should seriously watch To Be or Not to Be. To Be or Not to Be is a remake of an adaptation. The original starred Jack Benny, and it was remade by Mel Brooks. But it's about a Polish acting troupe that's putting on the last showing of Hamlet before the fall to Nazi Germany. And they have to keep trying to put the show on during the occupation. And it's very, very anti-fascist. It's a viciously anti-fascist movie. And I say viciously because they're mean to the Nazis. But it's real. And so Blazing Saddles, To Be or Not to Be, History of the World Part 1 with its set of class jokes. There's something being said in those movies. And that's why they're such broad farces, because you can't say it any other way.
We have a lack of that today, I think. There's a lack of edginess. There's especially a lack of edginess in comedy when it comes to talking about, social issues. There's a lack of nuance. There was a tremendous amount of nuance in The Producers and in Blazing Saddles.
There was a failure to understand what edginess is, because it's not edgy to punch down at socially weaker people or more marginalized people or poorer people? Where's the edginess in racism or queer bashing? How is that edgy in white America? I mean, that happens every day.
It's assimilation. I mean, it's like it reminds me of the bullies that have always existed in the schools. That, you know, I'm not talking about the one who has, that they always show in the movies, who has like abusive parents, so they became the bully, and they're from a poor community. They always try to glamorize that, but in reality, and there's actually research on this, most of the people that bully are not from that type of background. They're from privileged background with privileged parents who also have treated people this way in order for them
Yes.
to get in their station. It's the preppy kids. It's not the
Yes.
troubled teen who goes behind and smokes the weed.
You
But
know.
think about the stereotype that some of these shows always show the bullies to be that way, when that's
Well, bullying
the case.
is an expression of class.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. You can say all you want about the imperfection of 80s cinema. That's something, though, that is really made clear in John. I hate it when I can't remember a name.
John Hughes?
John Hughes.
Breakfast Club?
Yes, John Hughes. It's all about class. The bullies are the popular kids and the rich kids.
Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really good in Breakfast Club. I was just thinking about that movie a second ago as well, because, I can't remember his name. The one guy who ends up dating, you know, the preppy girl that Molly
Judd
Ringwald
Nelson,
plays.
Bender.
Judd Nelson's character, yeah.
Bender.
He is, you know, seen as the bully, but then when you get to know him, he's not. He's just, you know, kind of a rebel.
Well,
but the guy that was the true bully was the one that opened up about bullying
Emilio
guy
Estevez.
that was the nerdy guy that was there, you know.
Well, and he also
Emilio Estevez's character was the bully.
But he also talks about how he was peer pressured into bullying this kid.
That's right.
And also how his dad is mad at him for getting caught, not for bullying.
Mm-hmm. Which that was such a telling, and there was a lot of truth in that.
It really was. You see all this class, and you see, at least as it pertains to high school, you see all this class politics in all of John Hughes's movies. And that's a joke there, high school class politics. Ha ha ha. And
that takes me kind of to social media in my mind, because Jonathan Haidt, class politics, sorry, that took me a moment. my autism, it took me a moment. I was like, oh, a joke. But there's Jonathan Haidt did this. He did this whole piece in the New Yorker about, I think the title of it is "Why We're Getting Stupider," if I'm not mistaken. And it's about social media, and there's really amazing research in it. And it talks about how the loudest voices, the bullies online, they aren't the poor blue-collared worker, you know, like it is portrayed to be. They're the wine moms from suburbia.
The
They're like upper middle class white dudes. Well, and he said that that's the common thread on the people who bully like way far left, or the people that are like on the way far right. He said it's either way, the loudest voices are these people from upper middle class America.
Oh, yeah, it's true. It's true. Those are the people who can afford to do this without a day job. I have a day job. When I write something, I'm putting energy into that when I'm not working. When I'm doing this in the evening after I've worked a full day. Yeah. My guests, you know this, you're one of my guests, but my guests are giving up sleep to be here, especially if they're on the East Coast. So I totally understand. It's it's a miracle that anyone has ever watched this show. It's not just that, oh, I'd love to have more fans. It's, I'm glad anybody ever watches. It's a miracle. I'm lucky one person found me on the internet.
Well, we got Leon, Renee, and a few other
Yeah,
people with
no,
us
it's
tonight.
true.
So, hey, guys.
And I appreciate them all. It's true. But think about it, though. Think about all the work it takes to get one person to notice you on the internet. And then think about the fact that everybody who's supposedly making money from the internet as their primary profession, therefore has to be able to pay all their bills in order to do that stuff full time in the first place.
Most of them, and you know this, Chris, because you and I have had a lot of conversations about this offline, but I've been researching for about 6 months now to understand the independent media sphere. And something that I've captured that has been kind of mind-blowing to me is almost everyone that we know of that is like the bigger names in lefty media anyway are all from like a certain caste or class, and from literally parents who aren't just well known but affluent and part of the DC machine.
And
You have Matt Taibbi, and his dad
yes,
was a major commentator on the Taibbi was a commentator on NBC News.
yes,
He
he was
won
a
two.
reporter.
He won a Pulitzer and two Edward R. Murrow awards, which
He
good for him. But he comes from that, so
he
he gave
also
Matt the
wrote
breaks in the beginning.
he also wrote the book that defined Tawana Brawley as a infantilized child, so scared of her stepfather that she would hatch an elaborate plot to fake being gang raped.
That's right. That's
In
what
order to avoid being punished by her stepfather. Now, I understand that awful stuff happens in families. I'm not trying to minimize it. But most people in New York are more scared of the NYPD than their own families.
True.
Especially if they're black. Black people in New York have not had a close and loving relationship with the NYPD over the years.
Yep.
But she was labeled a liar. She was infantilized, basically treated like an extremely silly young child. We were supposed to believe all of this. But at the same time, we were supposed to believe that she thought up this elaborate plot to get away with it.
Yeah.
It's very
well. It explains Taibbi's, misogyny, and it explains his disconnect from working class issues.
Yes,
because of where what he grew up understanding.
I'm
He was one of the people that said, when I came forward about what happened to me, he was one of the people that said, well, it just looks like another Me Too smear, but I don't have any information, but I'm just going to assume. So I was like, you start from the place that the person is lying. Who does that?
Well, and let's talk. I mean, who was actually smeared by Me Too? That's a strong statement that requires supporting evidence.
Yeah,
who was smeared by Me Too? Is Matt saying Harvey Weinstein was smeared? Is he saying Kevin Spacey was smeared? Is he saying other people were smeared? Who?
At the end of the day, when somebody throws out a blanket statement such as that, or a blanket statement about Me Too, and they're centering the accused, I'm immediately suspect.
Yes.
Because, it seems to me that it's just a way to undermine real the very real issues of misogyny. And at the end of the day, it's also, even though it breaches beyond class, a lot of the abuses when it comes to domestic violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment are class-based as well.
Well,
A lot of times there is a financial dominance and a class gap. I mean,
well,
look at everyone from Harvey Weinstein to Jeffrey Epstein to, there's power dynamics and class dynamics to the wife that is afraid to leave her husband that beats her because they have to support themselves with a 2-person income, and it's almost impossible to do it by yourself. There's almost always, or the woman who doesn't want to turn in her boss because it's her job.
It's a terribly trite stereotype since Breaking Bad. But do you remember Weeds?
Mm-hmm.
She became a major criminal player because she just wanted to be able to support her family the same way she had when her husband was alive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it started. And it all got out of control from there.
Yeah. And so on, the folks that I had learned, and I know that we've talked about it a little bit, but there's also, of course, we know Max Blumenthal. His dad was, Blumenthal's, who he worked directly for the Clinton administration. And then you have who else is there? Aaron Mate. His dad is a famous psychologist and is a published author, and also has advised and made the rounds on all kinds of media and written several books. Lee Camp, who I like a lot of what Lee says, but he's also disconnected. He's from a different class. His mom is a federal judge in Bethesda, Maryland. Federal judge in DC, basically. That's and
what's the typical class background of a federal judge? Let's not ignore that.
Mm-hmm. Richard Medhurst, he's not some revolutionary in his basement. His mom and dad were in the UN. They won they won Pulitzer, or not Pulitzers, they won the Peace Award. What am I thinking about? I'm having mom brain. The Peace Prize. I know what this is called. Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
It's a group that won the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know why. Sometimes I lose words. Sorry about that. And his parents had been with a group that worked with the UN that won the Nobel Peace Prize. So they were very well known, very influential. He traveled the world with them. And so all these different people, Kim Iverson's parents had affluence. And so they talk about all these middle class issues as if they relate to them, Chris. And that's why I feel like they're off point on a lot of it, because
they have no experience with being working or middle class.
People are. Huh?
They have no experience with being working or middle class.
Mm-mm.
It's
not long-term experience. Anyway, they can say, "Oh, I delivered pizza while I was at college," and I'm like, that's not the same thing. As soon as you got out of school, you had doors open for you. You were able to, and Max admitted that. Max did on a show on Sabby the other day. He was like, my dad helped me. He was able to get me emails with Congress people. And I was like, us regular journalists, I'm a journalist, and I went to school for it, and I have, hundreds of published articles, and I've been doing beat work and grunt work for years. I can't just get a hold of a congressperson and interview them. Every once in a while you can, but it's very difficult. These people had the door open for them.
I have interviewed an ex-congressman. The highest political position of anybody in office who I have interviewed is a state representatives. Most notably, Ron Kim from New York. I also had a state representative from Maine on. Good people. But I haven't managed a sitting congressman yet.
I have, not as a journalist, but in my work, I'd interviewed a lot of candidates and stuff like that. But that's because I was helping to try to get them elected, and it's not quite the same thing. But if you don't, my issue is that sometimes they do good work. Sometimes these people do good work. I'm not saying that they never do, but my issue is, activists and people on the left, putting them on a pedestal. And, when the stuff comes out from Elon Musk to Matt Taibbi, for instance, and it's like a billionaire just gave some, kid who came from, the upper echelons a breaking story, they're like, oh, he gave it to an independent journalist who's like us, who's from the working class. And I'm like, no, he gave it to someone in the same class to release it, and to release on his terms.
And
it's not like he handed it off to,
and let's take it another step, because it's not just what Taibbi initially presented where, oh, this is me, I'm being given access. Now, according to Taibbi, he was given access, but according to Bari Weiss, she's heading up a team that's doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So is he getting his information directly from Elon, or is he getting it from Bari Weiss's team, or are he and Bari Weiss working in different directions?
I have no idea, and that's part of the problem.
That is part of the problem.
It's fine to protect your sources, if it's protected sources, but that's not what's happening here. So it doesn't feel like that's what's happening. And they haven't, if that is what's happening, typically in the story, let's talk about Watergate. They were like, we have to protect the identity of our source because it could put them at risk. Mm-hmm. They've not said anything like that. There's no journalistic ethics to this. It's just like, whoa, here's some information. And it's muddying the waters as to what journalism is, because it is interesting, but it's not in context. I feel like my problem with a lot of it is it's out of context. Like Matt Taibbi published something that talks about donors, right? Mm-hmm. He was like, the majority of Twitter are Democrats. And I'm like, no, what you just showed is individual donors donating to a political party during a presidential election. It doesn't mean, like, was that 5 people donating the $365,000 that he showed? Or was it 1,000 people from the company that donated $27 each?
And
there was no way to know, because it didn't have the amount in the screenshot he shared. It didn't have the amount of individual donations.
Let's not forget that that all these billionaires donate very liberally to both sides.
Oh, of course. And that's funny. He left out the screenshot. He cut it right above, because if he showed the full picture, if you go to Open Secrets, guess who Twitter donated the most to in 2016?
Trump.
Republicans. That's right. But he strategically, or whoever screenshotted that for him, strategically left that out.
Well, so let's remember that Bari Weiss said very specifically that, where am I here? That the right was being throttled and shadow banned and censored, yet the same information that she was laying out as she said this explained how libs of TikTok was given special protected status, and no one was supposed to no one was ever supposed to enforce any rules against the libs of TikTok account without speaking to someone in the proper management first. And so it's like you can't even tell a lie without presenting evidence that contradicts your own lie. But you want everybody to accept this as the truth.
Right.
And what that actually reveals is that Twitter was protecting an account that calls hits for terrorists. By protecting libs of TikTok and letting them continue to do what they were doing without, and saying, no, don't enforce the rules without talking to someone, they were protecting that activity and ensuring that it continued. And Elon Musk, with his expressions of support for the Libs of TikTok account, is expressing support for that activity.
Stop yelling.
That's true.
And when he says things like, the woke mind virus must be eradicated. Well, how do you do that? What's the next logical step? Now we're getting to the we've got to arrest and lock up communists thing that Hitler was saying.
Mm-hmm. It also kind of bends the reality of what free speech is. And I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I like it because I was talking to Zach and Gavin from the Vanguard, and Gavin, I was like, absolutism, like what about this, and this, like pornography and this stuff. And we were having a chat about it, and he said that he's a free speech maximalist, which I liked that kind of terminology. I like the free speech maximalist framing because I feel that way too. Like I believe that even abhorrent political speech should be protected, but people don't understand what the First Amendment is. It's not just you can post whatever you want. You can you can post that, you can just write somebody and say, I'm going to murder you tomorrow.
No, the First Amendment.
I'm going to murder you the first time that I see you in a grocery store. I'm carrying a gun. So, and then if you ask to have that taken down because that's a direct death threat, and then somebody's going to say, no, that's my free speech right.
And
no,
that's
it's
not how it works. And let's talk. That's a good example too, because you people want you to think that they're strict constructionists about taxes or the powers of the government or all this other stuff. They seem to be awfully loose constructionists when it comes to free speech, because all the First Amendment actually says is that the government can't punish you for your speech.
Mm-hmm.
The federal government will not abridge the right to free speech. That doesn't mean the state can't deem some specific speech a crime in the context of the state government, which has happened, and often raises censorship complaints. But it usually comes down to free speech guarantees in that state's constitution rather than anything federal, because the First Amendment is the federal government. And yes, this is a very good point. This is why we have sedition laws, even though we have free speech. Because while you can't stop someone from saying the government should be overthrown, you can stop someone from actually trying to overthrow the government or plotting to do so, or attempting to exhort others to do so. And even beyond that, whose speech is free? Do you feel like your speech is more free on Twitter under the Elon Musk regime?
No.
I don't feel like my speech is any more free. Well, I'm not the biggest fan of what I would consider liberals playing it being anti-fascist as opposed to real anti-fascists. I mean, Crime Think and Chad Loader aren't getting their accounts back. They got suspended after Elon Musk took over. So
that's true. That's the issue that I have in the framing from both releases, is that it's really centering that, right media gets suppressed. There's a narrative to it. And there really is a narrative to it. And it's an inaccurate narrative. That's the issue that I have, because we've literally seen leftist media be suppressed. We've watched it in real time. So
there is a long history of the angry, aggrieved right-winger standing on the street corner and haranguing the crowd about how oppressed he is, while basically doing nothing to threaten the status quo and telling them to go oppress some other oppressed person. I mean, the whole success of Nazism was that they were able to sidetrack people from organizing against capitalism and into organizing for the German people, which ultimately just meant the German state. And they ran editorial cartoons and full-page advertisements in other people's newspapers with pictures of Hitler being gagged under headlines, "Hitler muzzled by oppressive government."
Right.
This was while he was in jail for having tried to overthrow the government.
This is what people don't understand, is that memes aren't new.
Nope.
Really. Social media isn't new. I mean, memes, like you said, political cartoons used to be the meme of the day. People would sometimes print them off and circulate them, just standalone stickers and memes, or spray paint them on walls, or put posters up. That was the big thing, is you literally memed the city with posters, and people would put up posters and stickers.
All those little bootleg Calvins on the back of cars doing whatever activity that Bill Watterson wouldn't approve of and never licensed them for. What are those if not memes?
Yeah. Memes aren't new. Social media isn't new. I mean, radio, you had call-in talk show radios forever. People would call in and comment, or would write in, and editorials could be printed in newspapers. It's faster now. It's quicker now, and it is different, but it's not completely new. And so the powers that be can easily figure out how to manipulate it if you have any semblance of history and the history of media. Can I address a question in chat really fast, and then we can get back to this? Somebody asked me something, and I wanted to address it before I forgot. Red Rebel asked us, why does it matter who their parents are if they're telling the truth? Well, I agree. I said that sometimes they can have good content, as to the journalist from that background. However, my problem is the lack of humility with understanding what poor struggle is, even though that's one of almost all of their main talking points, is what poor people go through, what we're going through. This is a class war. This is this, that.
And are they always telling the truth?
Yeah. And they may be telling the truth from their worldview, but if everyone we have that's at the pinnacle of journalism, or even, some of them aren't journalists, but at the pinnacle of giving us and bringing us news in independent left media, are all from the same privileged background as the mainstream media, isn't that one of the biggest problems we have with some of the pundits and stuff on mainstream media, is that they're disconnected? Isn't that what we always say?
But they also lie, and we also say that. And because we say that,
truck nuts,
it really makes me feel the need to go back to this issue of, do they tell the truth? So, for example, Max Blumenthal went to a very well-off neighborhood in Caracas in order to report on Venezuela and to try to say, oh, look, they're doing so well down here that the American blockade isn't, the American sanctions aren't even hurting them. Now, mind you, that well-off neighborhood isn't all of Caracas.
Right.
I don't want to exaggerate the poverty in Venezuela, which is something that the right loves to do and blame on socialism. But there is poverty in Venezuela. The poorest people in Venezuela are hurt the most by the sanctions.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
And Max Blumenthal erasing the poor people of Caracas to show how the well-off people of his class aren't really feeling the sanctions that much. They're not a big deal. There's a dishonesty in that. It's not even just class blindness. There's a dishonesty in that. There's a decision to erase the poor people who are suffering because of the sanctions.
I think that's a really good point. And in that, it is a matter of perspective. So when I talk about this, I say, with lefty media, just be aware. I'm not saying to cancel them. I'm not saying not to watch them. I'm saying to understand in part where their worldview comes from. Just like people always like to mention the wealth that Tucker Carlson comes from, even though he tries to act like a regular working person. I'm not saying that their rhetoric is the same as Tucker Carlson, although some of the rhetoric is getting there. I'm going to admit it. But the thing is that for me, my major issue is a disconnect. When I listen to them talking about working class struggle or the issues that are the most important to American people, I see this disconnect because I'm like, that's what all the liberals are talking about. That's not what we're over here talking about. And the Democratic Party has been doing this to us for 30 years.
Yeah.
They've been running people to pander to us. They think that they're anti-woke, this whole rhetoric. Kim Iverson has done it. Max Blumenthal's done it. Aaron Mate, Richard Medhurst. They've all talked about this whole anti-woke, rhetoric. We don't like woke rhetoric. Woke rhetoric doesn't, Americans don't care about that. They don't care about trans issues. They don't care about queer issues. They don't care about, women's suffrage.
No,
they don't care about, but that's bullshit.
This is
bullshit. They're disconnected.
Well, they're reducing the working class to white men. And then they're assuming that white men think pretty much the same way they do, at least in the case of people like Taibbi. Taibbi's projecting his own feelings onto the working class.
Yes, and that's what neoliberals do. They're doing the same thing that neoliberals have been doing to us forever. So I see it as plain as day, and I'm watching it happen in real life, and I was like, this is how upper class rich people treat me or treat us. And then I start researching it, and I was like, they're all upper class rich people.
Yes.
They're from the elite. Because I dealt with people that went to Northwestern, as a journalist, people that went to like the edgy schools. And I went to Eastern Kentucky University. We're treated different. If you went to Northwestern or you went to Stanford or you went to the schools that are, the journalism schools or Wharton or something, you can get your foot in the door. EKU, even though we're one of the best schools in the country, we have some of the best professors and we have hands-on work and it's a good school. I see the same gatekeeping. I see the same propping someone up who went to Harvard. I see the same. Well, they have more legitimacy because they're rich and because somebody literally told me the other day, Chris, not to go on a rant, but this is, I got to get this out.
Rants are good.
People were saying the other day in a thread about this, they were like, well, isn't there milieu, where their background, where they're from, doesn't that make them more educated? And I'm like, this is the problem. No, it doesn't make them any smarter than a truck driver down the street, a coal miner working in the coal fields, a waitress at a restaurant. It doesn't make them any smarter because they came from the elite. We don't need the vanguard on the left to be a Stalin class traitor anymore because we are fully capable of reading now. We have information at our fingertips, and the vanguard can now be and should be the working fucking class.
Yes.
And I don't need a Matt Taibbi. I don't need these rich people to look up to anymore. I don't need that. I want a firebrand like fucking Afeni to follow.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? And I want us to stand together instead of, hero worshiping these people who aren't even from our fucking class. And so they're obsessed with the war, which is really important, Ukraine, but people are saying those are the most important things to Americans. It's important. I am not saying it's not important, Chris. We should not be funding Nazis in Ukraine. We also shouldn't be siding with Russia completely either, because they've done some shady shit too. But we should
well, China had this idea.
The regular working person on the street, you know what they're worried about right now? They're worried about, I was just evicted and I don't have a new place yet and I don't have a job. They're worried about putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their head. They're not worried about what these liberal elitists are worried about. And right now, our left pundits, a lot of the major left pundits that people are listening to, are literally, ironically, they're liberal elite talking about the elite. Now, some people have said, well, if they're class traders, then that's good. Well, I'm like, well, I've never heard them talking about their parents or their class or how they're a class trader.
Jackson Hinkle,
they're not open about it. They love to hide it and pretend like it's not there.
Jackson Hinkle did that lies my parents told me tweet, and his father is, we never told you anything like that. Where are you getting off saying we told you that?
It for me, it's generational poverty versus generational wealth is a topic that they never talk about, and they get real squeamish. I know, because I've been on calls asking him about it. I've been on call-ins where I've just completely asked him about it, or in chat, and they responded. They get squeamish. A lot of these people from the upper classes get squeamish when you talk about generational poverty and generational wealth, because they benefited from generational wealth. And if our talking heads are going to ignore the impacts of generational poverty, we have a problem. And that's why a lot of times they'll focus on foreign affairs, they'll focus on the wars, they'll focus on that. They're not talking about if I give Lee Camp credit, because he does a lot of times talk about this, and he's spot on, and I give Lee credit for that. I'm going to be fair. But the rest of them, I'm going to tell you the damn truth. I don't hear them talking about working class issues. I don't hear them talking about the struggling.
Hey,
I hear them talking about like foreign affairs, stuff. It's important. I'm not saying foreign affairs isn't important. It is. But domestic issues are important too, and you can't wash over one for the other. And my problem is they're saying that the foreign affairs are the most important thing on the list.
And beyond that, the biggest working class issue of the past 5 years is COVID. And Max Blumenthal was down there at that Nazi rally with people who planned the January 6th uprising, and standing there with a dumb look on his face while Bobby Kennedy said that basically Anne Frank only had to hide because Hitler wanted to vaccinate her, or something equally stupid. It was just the worst thing. And then
his whole argument is we need to work with libertarians. We need to, and I'm like, you know what? Most libertarians ain't even showing up for this nonsense. This is still elite, rich people are MAGA.
The libertarians are more Republican than ever. The Libertarian Party is more Republican than it has ever been. Up until Joe Jorgensen, the last several nominees had all been Republicans and not libertarians. Jo Jorgensen was not necessarily the best kind of libertarian. She seemed to represent the Alan Dershowitz wing of the party, with her open speculation about, do we really need an age of consent? But Nathan Robinson,
creepers too. That's so ironic, because they're always talking about grooming, but they're the ones that are like passing. They're chipping away the age of consent to marry, and they're trying to marry. Some of these theocrats are trying to marry their daughters off at like 13 to like 60-year-old men.
We're supposed to be worried about queer people being the groomers.
Right, but these theocrats are literal groomers.
Exactly.
It's disgusting. I'm like,
I
literally.
mean, where
That's
were
the
the
philosophy. Marry
where
them
were
all
the
young so that they can only have one person, and
where
then they basically become a slave to that person.
where were the queer people in Warren Jeff's church? Those were straight people, straight
That's
rednecks
right.
with money.
It's deflection and projection. It's
And
classic, you know.
and it's like when Matt Taibbi talks about working class people, or worse, young people, and he says, well, young people are going to become conservatives because the left doesn't have a sense of humor. What he's saying
It's not
is he
true
thinks that
either.
making fun of queer people is funny, and that people are going to become conservatives because they want to make fun of queer people, and the left won't let them. That's what he's basically saying.
And it's not true. And you know what? It cracked me up. I don't support either party, you know this, but it cracked me up when their strategy failed and fell on its face in this election cycle, because all of a sudden they were like, but we thought Gen Z were going to all run out and vote Republican, and it was going to they've been talking about a red wave, and I've been, talking to some of them, and I'm like, no, you guys, like, I tried to say, I've been trying to get the message across, and you know this, for like a year now. Well, a lot longer, but especially this last year, because it's become a talking point for them that, 50% of the country are MAGA and the other 50% are Democrat. When the
Not
truth
how it
is,
works.
MAGA's what, like 11%?
So
MAGA,
here's where it gets complicated, because MAGA is bigger than it used to be. When Donald Trump was running in 2016, diehard MAGA was like 40% of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is like 23% of America. So we were talking like 40% of 23%.
Right.
On the other hand, you have to understand that the people who voted for Donald Trump were mostly white people. And the reason that the people who voted for Trump gave was, quote, economic anxiety, unquote. Now, there was a lot of stuff in the media about how, economic anxiety is bullshit. These folks are racist. And then there was a lot of stuff on the left. No. Economic anxiety is real. It's not about racism. People were scared. But then when you talk about economic anxiety, you're talking about the fear of losing what you have. You're not talking about the stress of being poor. Poor people have all sorts of anxiety, but it's not economic. I know I'm poor. I'm not worried about getting poor. I am poor. I worry about being homeless, and I try not to be homeless, but so far so good.
Right.
And I'm not trying to dismiss homelessness either. It's just you only worry about losing what you have. You don't worry about losing what you don't have.
Or the edge you have, because you don't have an edge. I think that that's a lot more compelling, the worry about losing the edge you have, to the worry about losing what you don't have. Like, for instance, this goes right into what you're talking about. Most people don't know, but the majority of Trump voters were suburbia, upper middle class suburbia. And you look at it, even in New York and California, and these places that were supposed to be elite, in some of the richest neighborhoods and in some of the upper middle class neighborhoods, they were voting for Trump even there. And the exit polling showed that a lot of the reasons that these people that weren't like crazy MAGA voted for Trump, one simple reason: tax cuts.
Well, sure.
They wanted more money in their pockets. And at the end of the day, that was, I don't think a lot of people remember 2016. That was everyone's literal excuse. Were there racist and stuff? Yes, absolutely. But most people just held their nose on the racism and voted so that they would get more
But
taxes back.
but that comes back to the fact that tax cuts are racist.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
So I
And
I
they
talked about
favor
this.
they favor married couples too.
Even beyond that, I talked about this a couple of shows ago. In California, they passed Proposition 13, very famous, restructured all of California's property tax systems
Mm-hmm.
around this along this false premise of equality, where basically the richest owners of the most expensive properties were taxed the same as the poorest owners of the crappiest properties. And the reason they did
Equality.
this, yes, equality.
That's why we need to not use that word, and we should be saying equity. I don't want equality. I want equity.
But the reason they did this was because they wanted to defund public school. Specifically, they wanted to defund public school in poorer neighborhoods, especially black neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Also brown neighborhoods, but poorer neighborhoods in general. And the reason they wanted to do this is they wanted their kids to have their built-in advantage.
That's right. So much of what the upper middle class does comes from the fact that white folks got an advantage after World War II. They were able to buy homes, they're able to have property, and the whole value system, you know, this is do everything you can, you know, so your kids don't have to struggle. And there's virtue in that, you know, so I don't fault them for that, because as a parent, I can understand it, you know, with my heart. I know my mom, for instance, she would do anything she could for me if she could, if we had it struggling, you know, we struggle, but if she would have been able to, she would have. But because of generational poverty, everyone that I talk to, like back in the day, for instance, here's a great example. This is what a lot of people don't realize. If you worked for AT&T, if you worked for Westinghouse, if you worked for Microsoft, if you worked for, this was pre-80s to the early 90s, before all of Reagan's tax stuff went into effect. Companies were required to, if they were a public option, stock option, in order to give a percentage of stock to their employees. Mm-hmm. And that's how all these boomers got fucking rich, is they had stock options, and also buying homes was super easy for them. It wasn't hard. It was easy to buy a home. And a lot of them.
Rating. Let's just forget that. No credit rating.
No credit rating.
If you were buying your first house, you have a good job. Okay. What do you make every month? Okay. Here's what your payment's going to be. Okay.
If you were white.
Well, if you were white, it's true. However, and this part can't be forgotten. There was a class of black capitalists that was created by segregation and Jim Crow, that was wiped out by the formal end of those things. It was a big loss of black wealth. And what people told themselves is, we are making a trade-off. Our richest people are giving up their wealth in order for social equality. Well, but then what's social equality without wealth in America, where money equals freedom?
Right. It's true.
I mean, the one thing that America has proven is you can't have a classless society in capitalism. Andrew Jackson's democracy for all white men still required women and slaves. And today's conservatives think Andrew Jackson was too progressive.
Yeah. The guy who sanctioned the Trail of Tears is too
Yes,
progressive.
because he let white men who didn't own property vote.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
The voting with ownership of property is one of the most egregious things that some Republicans are calling for right now.
they want to go back to that. They
Knowing that so
want
many
to
of
go
them are
back to that.
landlords and literally have to rent out to people who don't own anything, and how our entire millennial generation, almost all of us are, and very few of us are homeowners.
Well, and how would landlords make any money if there weren't any people who had to rent? And then how many people in both parties of Congress are some kind of landlord?
Mm-hmm. The buying up of the foreclosing on homes and buying up of properties is also one of the most egregious things that's happening. I mean, there's
And
so many homes that are either sitting empty or being rented out. Before you wouldn't see a neighborhood in suburbia with half of the homes being rental property. But now that's what it is, because we can't buy, and they don't want us to buy. They don't want us to be homeowners.
I mean, even the people who can buy.
I usually don't use
I
they.
will never.
Here,
I will never.
those who benefit.
I will never stop stressing this. If you have a 30-year mortgage that's not going to be paid off until you're ready to retire, maybe, if you're lucky, do you really own your home?
No. Mm-mm.
I mean, you're renting it from the bank for 30 years with a lease to own.
You're already renting. Mm-hmm. It's true. The only reason that I would want a mortgage is because, one, I can paint the home or do whatever the hell I want to do it. I can plant whatever I want to in the yard, and as long as it's not under some bullshit HOA.
But you're also
and then the other is because it's cheaper per month.
But
renting's expensive.
You're also responsible for all that property though now too. And in some places they're going to cite you if you don't take care of it the way they think it should be taken care of.
HOAs, yeah.
Well, not even necessarily HOAs. It's just unsightliness laws.
And sometimes I can see the function of that if it's like causing rodents or like other problems for like in the houses around, but I'm pretty lenient on that.
Well, that's the whole thing is nobody ever evicted my grandparents from their nice little suburban house for their slovenliness, even though they couldn't use their dining room table anymore. So, I mean, but so they're very selectively enforced. But the primary purposes of those kinds of unsightly.
Sorry, my animals are going crazy. I'll mute.
Is to punish the poorest people in the neighborhood.
That's true. Half the time, the people that are enforcing that are just people that want to feel important, especially in the HOA. It's someone who has her own little fiefdom. It's basically serfdom, Somebody that has their own little fiefdom, and they make sure that the neighborhood looks like it should so that it doesn't hurt their property values. That's snobbery bullshit, that first world problem bullshit. I can't, it's one of the things I really can't stand. It turns my stomach to even think about it. But there's something else that this reminds me of, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping around too much, but tiny homes.
Yes.
Tiny homes, I wouldn't mind to have like a tiny home if I had like a storage unit where I could keep like my seasonal stuff. And I love Christmas decorations, so I could keep that stuff. But tiny homes have now gotten bougie and boutique. So you have rich people buying up tiny homes and buying up small pieces of property so they can have a vacation home. Well, motherfuckers, I just want a home to live in. Like, I would just like a house. Like, can we at least keep one thing for poor people? Like, can we have one thing that you guys don't come in, market, and push us out of existing in? You know what I mean?
Do you know what a pastoral was?
Mm-mm.
So a pastoral was this specific form of drama, which was about rich people going to the country and playing at being poor. And rich people would imitate these pastorals and go into the country and play at being poor. And that's how camping started. The rich people were playing at being homeless. And it sounds funny, but it's true. The difference between John Muir and a hobo was that John Muir was actually rich and could go home at the end of the day.
That's true. Now, I love camping, and I'm poor, and everyone around here loves camping and are poor, because that's one thing we can do for very little money while we're poor. You know, that's one activity. But you are right.
It started out as the rich people going on their big tracts of land and playing at being poor.
Yeah, that you've got they read Walden, or, you know, they looked up to all these people that go on safari, like Roosevelt. You know how the Franklin Roosevelt was always in his like, oh no, Teddy Theodore was always in his like safari gear and going on adventures.
He was a cowboy.
Mm-hmm.
But no,
that is true, and there is a lot of kind of circles everything back. I think cosplaying poor, just like the right wing does, just like, you know, some of these pundits do, just like wealthy people do. And I don't know why, but that's not anything that's been new. People who have a lot like to say that they struggle. But what's really strange is people that struggle like to have a lot of pride and don't like to say that they don't have a lot. So one really telling thing that I've always seen is we worked hard for it. We worked our fingers to the bone to get where we're at and blah, blah, blah. When a poor person actually says, I'm grateful, a lot of times says, I'm grateful for the little bit that I have. I had a lot of people help me along the way. I didn't get here alone. It's a crazy thing, because someone from generational poverty a lot of times will be like, I didn't get here alone. I had a lot of people help me. I'm really grateful for what I was able to have. But then you have wealthy people that are, this isn't across the board true for everyone, but I think there is some truth to this culturally, that will be like, oh, no one helped me. I did all this on my own, you know, I worked so hard, and they feign at that. Because if they have to tell you.
So let's talk about.
I heard Max Blumenthal talking about how he used to deliver pizzas before he got where he was at. I was like, dude, if you're talking about how you delivered pizzas one time and you used to live in an apartment, you're not poor. Because we don't talk about that, because that's just how we live.
Yeah.
Like, we just assume that we are all have delivered pizzas one time, or used to waitress, or, you know, that's just a part of life. You go to work when you're 15 so that you can help your family, you know?
It's true. That's how it works for a lot of people. And when people act like it's not normal, they're telling on themselves.
I know. That's what I was like. He was like, when I first started out, I was delivering pizzas and living in an apartment. And I was like,
okay.
So you learned, that was his, I learned what it was like. I lived in the poor man's shoes for like 6 months. You know, I don't know how long. Honestly, I'm being facetious, but that is how it comes across. And that's how I can tell the difference.
The Zapatistas have this thing where if you want to be able to lead the poor, you have to learn from the poor, which means you have to go live with them and share their daily life and their daily work,
like Undercover Boss
with them. No, not like Undercover Boss, because in Undercover Boss, nobody knows who that guy is.
Right, true.
In the Zapatista thing, it doesn't matter who you are. You're joining the community and living in the community. So it's
That's
not the
interesting.
same. Instead of it being cosplaying, you're actually doing it.
That's fascinating.
And
And
it's
where were what are where are they
the
from? The
Zapatistas are
Zapatista.
in Chiapas in Mexico.
Okay.
The uprising started in the 90s, and originally the plan was intended to actually take over Chiapas and secede from Mexico. But
That's
as
interesting.
time went on, they adjusted, and basically what they've managed to do is maintain autonomy and uh, cooperation between rural farm settlements, so that people are able to feed and take care of themselves and support their communities, instead of starving while feeding Mexico, which was the situation they were in before.
That's cool. I'm gonna go look them up and learn about this because this is the first time I've ever heard about this movement. Thank you,
Yeah,
Chris. That's
no,
awesome. It's
it's
really fascinating that one of their things are, you have to learn how other people live. I
well,
think that's really
specifically, you have to be poor in Mexico before you can be expected to take any sort of responsibility for anything. You can't just talk the talk and learn theory. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be educated and understand ideas or political theory, but you also have to know how the oppressed live.
Yep. And I think that's why I'm so fiery about this subject and why I researched these pundits and stuff. And that's kind of what it comes down to. I felt a disconnect. I was like, you don't understand. Like, I feel this desperation, this visceral stomach turning when we talk about incrementalism. It's it's a sadness too, and a frustration and an anger and a desire for community. And I feel like a lot of these pundits are empty to that. It really does. Before I even knew what their backgrounds were, I felt like I'm listening to a when you walk into a job or a space, my brother and I were talking about this. I feel like people can sense the poor in me. And I don't know how to fake it away so that I can get a good job. So, I end up getting like a lot of times entry level jobs and stuff like that, even though I'm way more qualified for that. Or, people treat me differently. I can't explain it. Somebody will walk in from the other class and they'll be holding themselves with a confidence. They have the manner of speaking. They bring that to the table. Do you know what I'm talking about? They have the dress. They've got the background. Their house looks perfect. They've got the big cathedral ceilings
They
behind them.
have the
And
narcissism.
those people are respected on the Zoom calls or the meetings. The people that look and act like that. I'm like, they're already rich. They've already got but those people are respected. But if you come and you're doing your Zoom from a double wide, even if you dress nice, even if you speak clearly, it's like the poor is sensed. And I feel the same thing with these pundits because I feel like a lot of people on the left are cosplaying activism too. And I feel like with these pundits, there is a disconnect because I can sense that same thing because I think that it's also ingrained in us poor folks to respect those people too, to see them as more educated or to see them as the authority on whatever the subject is, right? And to not trust ourselves and to not trust other people like us. That's why, the snake oil salesman or the preacher, the rich preacher, or the pundits that we watch on mainstream media, or the Max Blumenthals or whoever it might be, resonate with people
Even
is because we see them as an authority over someone who's poor, or it comes out that they're poor. Occasionally you could shake that up, like with my bestie Paula Jean Swearingen, she shakes it up sometimes. But we went through that on her campaign where people treated her that way.
Oh, I
This
see
is
how I
healthy.
still see how people in West Virginia, some of them treat Paula Jean just on Twitter. It's ridiculous.
Oh, where did you go to school, Paula? Why are you an authority on this? And she's like, because I've lived through it. That's not. I'd rather hear someone talk about it than someone who
You're a
lived through it.
terrible candidate. It's like, okay, a terrible candidate because she told the truth. I mean, what didn't you like?
Mm-hmm. And if you see them explain it, sometimes it's just that she wasn't. They knew she was one of the poors. They're like, how
Yeah,
dare one of the poors run for Congress, right?
yeah.
How dare one of the poor start a YouTube channel? And one thing stuck out to me when Max Blumenthal was talking to Sabby the other day, Sabby Sabs. He said, he was like, journalists shouldn't be paid.
I
I'm like,
remember that.
you're someone who's talking about, and yeah, he's like, anyone can be a journalist. I'm like, there's ethics and stuff that goes into journalism. There's like ways to report. If you want to be an actual journalist, anyone can talk about issues and anyone can report things, but there is an ethics
Well,
to
so,
journalism. There's
so,
fundamental
but,
foundational values.
but is it really? Obviously, there's some sarcasm here. Is it really hard is it really necessary to go to journalism school to manage to do better at journalistic ethics than Max Blumenthal?
True. And it's not even really necessary to go to journalism school. I don't think it helps, but it's not necessary. But I think
No,
understanding the foundations of journalistic ethics is helpful. You know what I mean? Like how to source, how to interview, how to research, how to FOIA, how to send a Freedom of Information Act request, things like that could be really helpful.
there
But when
was,
he says that they shouldn't be paid,
yeah.
I was like, yeah, they should. Why would we not pay people working to get us the truth?
So when people say that politicians shouldn't be paid or that journalists shouldn't be paid, then my immediate thought is, well, then how are they going to live? Because this is capitalism. And
Oh,
then my
no, it's
second
supposed to
thought
be
is,
people that are rich enough to just do it on their own, which is who does it in the first place, Chris. That's
exactly.
how Blumenthal started out. He was wealthy enough to take the bullet. What's
Well,
her name?
how many?
Kim Iverson. She was wealthy enough to stop for a whole year just to set up her YouTube channel.
So Rachel Maddow makes millions now.
Mm-hmm.
But even before she made millions, the reason that she was able to spend her time doing stuff for Air America instead of go out and get a real job, as they say, is that her family was kind of well off. She
Mm-hmm.
went to Stanford with Cory Booker. They were buddies.
Yeah. See, Ivy League, man. Journalism's really snotty with this stuff.
Well, Stanford is the Harvard of the West, and that means more than just academic snootiness.
Mm-hmm.
Those
It's
connections.
all those connections. Yep. And so, I feel like people can just smell the poor. There's no way around it. But I think that if these people want to be revolutionaries and independent, for one, they shouldn't be telling people that they don't deserve a living wage for work that they're doing.
Yeah.
And for two, maybe step back and sit down and hand the microphone to some of the poor people struggling and hear from them. I mean, there's only a few places that ever actually interview poor people. There's only a few news outlets out there that ever talk to poor people.
It's true. I
You
don't
don't
know.
see Max Blumenthal going out talking to poor people.
Nope.
When's the last time Glenn Greenwald talked to poor people? Kim Iverson, how many of these workers she's always talking about has she gone out and talked to?
Matt Taibbi is not talking to the white working class people he speaks for.
Yeah, and he calls it gonzo journalism. And I was like, dude,
you don't even do heroin.
This isn't gonzo journalism.
If he were, I'm serious, if he were really trying to be Hunter Thompson today, he would be out there doing fentanyl to find out if it would really kill him as easily as the cops say. Because that's the sort of thing Hunter Thompson actually did.
Well, Hunter Thompson was a poor Appalachian.
Yes. Yes.
So I don't like rich boys trying to mimic that. It gets on my nerves. I'm just being honest.
Oh, of
Hunter
course.
Thompson was a poor Appalachian, and that's why he wrote the way he did.
So
He
I
talked to poor people
will
all the time.
I will disagree on one level.
Yeah.
Hunter Thompson was raised a poor Appalachian.
True.
The Hunter Thompson who was writing for Rolling Stone was no longer poor.
I agree, and he did change.
And it's important to it's always important to keep those things in mind. You can see how success and legitimacy can change the best people for the worse.
True.
I don't think anyone would have ever expected the day to come when Julian Bond was the anti-establishment candidate and John Lewis was the pro-establishment candidate. But it happened one day. And we forget how, Tom Hayden was one of the actual revolutionaries with Students for a Democratic Society. And he ended up another well-off liberal politician and businessman.
Who was that?
Tom Hayden.
I'm not familiar with Tom Hayden.
So Tom Hayden was one of Jane Fonda's ex-husbands. He was one of the people, let me look it up, the Chicago 10. Yes, he was one of the Chicago 10. He was a member, he was one of the bigwigs with Students for a Democratic Society, which was very active in trying to make connections between students and the working class in Chicago.
That's interesting.
They successfully made connections in Appalachian neighborhoods in Chicago that led to the founding of the Young Patriots organization. They successfully made connections in Black neighborhoods in Chicago that led to the founding of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. It's good to remember some of this stuff, but at the end of the day, he became a liberal Democrat and got elected to Congress.
Interesting.
And after that, no more communist revolution. People change. That's
priorities change. Yeah.
Yes, especially when you grow into the responsibilities of the ruling class.
Yep. And that's why we can't look to billionaires to solve things. That's why we can't look to Elon Musk to all of a sudden make Twitter, the bastion of free speech or whatever.
And this is where the cosplaying comes in from rich people trying to pretend to be working class again. This whole social,
that's because we're cool. Us working class, we're the cool ones.
They don't. No. It's not that the working class are cool. It's that a working class aesthetic gives a rich liberal authenticity.
That's right. I was being facetious, but you're absolutely right.
I know.
It gives them authenticity, and it gives them weight to claim that what they're talking about when it comes to these issues is legitimate. Yeah. Even though it's detached from reality of the situation. For me, and I think I mentioned this a second ago, but I didn't go into it. It's the arrogance.
Yes.
The arrogance I have dealt with and seen my entire life that rich people know better than you just because they thought it. Just because they thought it, it has more legitimacy to a decade of work that you've done. How
Mm-hmm.
many people have experienced that that's poor? Like a new manager comes in and you're literally training the manager on how to do their job, and they're being arrogant to you. They have the degree or they have some connections or something, and you're training that person to do their job that you should have gotten anyway because
Yeah.
you know the work. How many of us has dealt with that? That's poor. That's from poverty. A
Yeah.
lot of us. And then you've also got the let me tell you what you want as a poor person from these pundits. Let me tell you what poor people are thinking about. Let me tell you what's on poor people's minds. And I think, how do you know? I've talked to 20,000 voters in my last 10 years of organizing. I'm not making assumptions. I've studied this for a decade. I'm not making assumptions. I've also, door knocked and organized in workplaces, and I've been poor myself. But even as one poor person, I didn't make assumptions. I learned all of this from all these years of work.
Well,
What are these
why
people
are the
basing it, what messaging is going? Because messaging to the working class is part of what I did. So I had to learn it. I
yeah,
didn't step into it with any assumptions, though. I listened. I
yeah,
spent years listening. Does that make sense? But
yeah.
they haven't even listened. They
Well,
haven't taken the time. So they just literally like pull it out of their butts.
the
And then they're like,
first
this is how it is. And I'm like, and then people believe them. I was like, what?
the
Like, I
first
would believe a Jonathan Haidt because he's been studying this for 35 years.
mm-hmm.
But what the fuck does a Kim Iverson know about who the fuck has she talked to? What's she talking about? She basing it on election results because they don't tell us anything. Like,
Who
what is
does
she
she think?
exit
Who
polling?
does
Like, what are you
who
basing
does
it?
she think working class people are? Let's start there. Who does
That's a
Kim
good
Iverson think
question.
working class people are?
That's a good question.
Um,
This is where the discussion will also shift to where people from an upper echelon will say, it's the billionaires against everyone else. And then you're like, well, what about the millionaires? What about the landlords? What about the business owners that own a business with like 1,000 people? They don't, what are you talking about? They're working class too. And I'm like, oh,
so
okay. And I'm not saying that we should all be at war with each other, but I'm saying if you can't even acknowledge the systems that give those people a massive advantage over the poorest of us, which when the poorest of us are like 40% of the country, then we have a problem. I
we
mean, the
do.
poorest of us, I mean, the people that make $40,000, $50,000 and below are what, around 48% of the country? $50,000 and below is poverty wages this day and age. So half of our country is making poverty wages.
And depending on where they live, it's even worse.
Yep.
I hate to feel sorry for the poor folks making six figures, but there are
They
people who are
exist.
living hand to mouth in New York City,
Yep.
and
Well, a better way to look at it is people, instead of saying the dollar amount, actually,
yeah,
and this is something I wasn't thinking, but you reminded me, like, the people that have to pay out 80% to
yeah,
90% of what they make just to survive. I'm talking just
yes.
basic transportation,
Well,
basic food, and basic
well,
housing.
let's
That
start
is
with,
60%, 60 to 65% of our country have
let's
to pay out 80 to 90% of what they make just to survive.
let's
So they
start with
only have 10% for savings, if that.
let's start with rent. I get three or four. No, I'm sorry. I usually get two or three paychecks a month, depending on how everything is stacked out. Usually two. First paycheck pays the rent.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't have anything left over, I don't have anything left over. The rent needs to get paid first.
Right.
So it doesn't matter how much it doesn't matter how much it doesn't matter how much money you make every year if your first paycheck every month is gone immediately because of your rent. That means that you're now paying catch up for the rest. You're now playing catch up for the rest of the month, no matter how much you actually make, because you're now going to be paying late fees on all the things that have to wait for the second check of the month.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make six figures, you make six figures, but that doesn't change the fact that if your rent is high enough that it eats up your first check, you're still playing catch up for the rest of the month.
To pay for rent that's the standard rate where you live, yeah, absolutely. Or that's adequate housing for your family. You know, I mean, if somebody goes out and they buy, you know, some rich person who has is renting a home with like 40 rooms in it, might be like, well, half of what I make goes to my summer home. And it's like, okay, yeah, no, that doesn't count, dude. No. Like, but for the average person, absolutely. You know, if the standard rate of rent takes half of your paycheck, you're in poverty. You're in poverty. That's why $15 minimum wage is an asinine concept.
Yeah. Well, if you just
calling for a living wage,
if you just went, and really that's the thing, a living wage. But then you have to, well, what is a living wage? How do you compute that? And then you come to the point that we have a poverty formula from 1950 that doesn't even take rent into account. And what have we just said? That you're poor if your rent takes all of your first paycheck for the month. So with that in mind, there are a whole lot of people who are poor, who are way outside of that federally mandated poverty limit.
Mm-hmm. And according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, or no, this is a Census Bureau. I love the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. They're one of the bureaus that actually does really good work. But the Census Bureau, 11.6% of the country, according to the census, is in poverty. And that is 37.9 million people. But what the poverty guidelines for that is for one person, $12,000 a year.
Yes, that's
Two
what
people,
I'm saying.
$17,000 a year. So how in the hell are 31 million Americans, or 11% of Americans, living on $17,000 a year?
And that's really the problem. That
poverty level, that's been almost the same since 1970. It was considered like 17,000. Well, are you kidding me? Like a soda used to be 5 cents.
The formula that they use is from 1950 and hasn't changed since 1950.
Right.
So when you say the 70s, yeah, no, long before that, 1950, it hasn't changed.
It's crazy.
I wrote about it during the 2020 election, actually, because I was explaining how this is right now, how poorly off you have to be for the government to say officially that you're poor, which means a lot of poor people actually make more than that, because obviously you can't have a definition of poverty that includes all the poor people. Then you'd have to help them all. And then who's going to do your essential labor?
Yep. So they keep us there so that we can wash their cars and clean their windows and clean their houses and drive their trucks. And there's merit to all of that work, but they want us, the problem is they want us to do it. They want us to do it for nothing. We don't.
What would happen if everyone in America got a college education, if every adult in America had a college education, would there be enough jobs for them all that would pay for their student loans?
Those that happened.
Yeah, I
So
know.
a large percentage of millennials went out and we got a college education because we were told to.
Yeah.
But then we couldn't get the jobs, and the jobs were still given to the rich kids, and we were like, fuck.
Yeah,
we're doing the thing. And
exactly.
they're like, no, we need you to go and work at Hollister so that we can go and look for our clothes and we have someone to help us. And that's essentially what happened. It's like, no, you were in your caste. This is a caste system, a feudalistic society. You were in your caste and you don't get to breach beyond it, but you did get to get an education. So that's cool.
Even working class Joe Biden had a father who was a used car dealer who could give him a Corvette when he turned 18. So, I mean, think about that. Working class Joe, really? How many working class people you know got a Corvette for their 18th birthday?
That's the definition. That's part of the problem, is that upper class suburbia has been defined as the working class.
Yes.
And that's who everyone wants to focus on.
Yep. And that's pretty much the case. It's true.
And they write the rest of us off because obviously it's somehow our fault that we're this poor.
Well, on this note,
we're not working hard enough, or we would have the home and we would have all this other stuff, or our parents didn't work hard enough and we just have to like deal with it, which none of that's true. Because there was an NPR, and I wish I could find it because I heard it about 10 years ago, and I was traveling, 7 years ago, because I was traveling when I first started Brand New Congress, and I heard this guy talking about, he was a reporter and a researcher, and it was fascinating. And there's a documentary, and I wish that I could remember the name of it. If you ever come across it, Chris, let me know, because I've been trying to find it for a while. But this guy followed these families for 20 years, these middle-class families. And he was following them as they developed upper middle-class families, good neighborhood, nice 2-story homes, that kind of thing. Their kids, it was interesting. There was one story that stuck out to me. And he was talking about how the parents gave their kids, when they got married, a down payment from each side of the family to buy their first home, right? Yeah. And he said when anyone that was from wealth told their stories, they changed it to act like they worked so hard for everything they had and they had no advantages. So when they first purchased the house, in order for them to buy some of the furniture and stuff, the parents were like, let's clear out the house and let's have a yard sale. Just a little bit of bonus money. So you know what story that couple says now, 20 years later, about how they got their first home?
We had to have a yard sale to pay for our house.
They don't mention the $50,000 that their parents gave them for the down payment.
Well, it's like, so when you look at even the most genuine self-made stories, they had something to start with, even if it wasn't a lot. For example, Carl Karcher, who founded Carl's Jr., and his wife had a car that they owned outright that they could afford to go get a loan on because they didn't owe any money on it. So they could borrow money against it.
They don't even let you do that these days.
Can you imagine that now?
Even if your car's paid off, they're not going to give you a loan on your car unless you've already got money.
Not enough to buy a hot dog cart and start a business.
No, poor people we don't get to get loans. That's another thing.
That's a whole nother thing, is they talk about Carl Karcher went ahead and hawked his car to buy a hot dog cart, and it paid off into a fast food empire. Yeah. And he also had friends who helped him get ahead in business. Bill Gates, who's about as close to a self-made billionaire as it gets, had upper middle class parents who were well positioned in the professional elite, who had an idea about what was coming down the pipeline and what sort of education would give him the best leg up.
And pitched him to Apple.
Yes, and more importantly than anything else, because of his connections.
For IBM, sorry.
Because of his connections and the people his parents knew, even though they weren't rich themselves, there was always somebody there with a bag of money when Bill Gates needed it.
That's absolutely right.
It was just always there. There was always someone there for George W. Bush every time something failed, with another bag of money to start him on the next project. So he kept failing up.
Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes.
Many people don't realize her parents were upper middle class. They gave her and her family, they gave her a whole bunch of money to get started. I think the only story was Zuckerberg was upper middle class, but he just ended up writing this.
Let's remember that Zuckerberg was in Harvard when he invented the prototype.
That's right.
So if you start right there, okay, he's already at Harvard. So whatever the circumstances of his birth, he's not working class or middle class now.
Oh, he was able to avoid classes, just write this thing, and had plenty of an allotment to have a car and go eat and had food and was fully taken care of. Now imagine if you were a regular college kid, could you pour into a project like this, or would you have to be working full-time job and you had to go to class because you are going to be in debt. Your parents aren't paying for your college, so you're not going to throw your classes away. Some poor person going to Harvard isn't going to throw their classes away to write code for this. They're not going to take those sacrifices.
It's true. It's absolutely true. The only people who can
start a chauvinistic top 10 website about women's boobies
is true. You
Which
can't.
Is where Facebook got its start.
It's true. And that's really a good place. That's really a good place to stop, because that's where capitalism has taken us, is where the richest people in the world have thought up things like Facebook and Amazon, or worse, they're just naked corporate raiders like Elon Musk, who never did or thought up anything, just kept buying it from other people.
Oh, but Chris, he's exposing what happened in Twitter right now, so he's such a hero.
Yeah, we talked
We're
about
so distracted. The fact that Twitter censorship and all of that, I understand that it's important to some people and it should be something that we talk about, but the fact that people act like that's the biggest issue in our country is very telling to me. I'm like, I care about it. I care about the rise of fascism. I care about censorship. I really care about the rise of fascism because it's what we're talking about with corporate monopolies. But talking about a little bit of censorship on Twitter, I care. But it's not. People get wrapped up in it like it's more important than mass incarceration.
There's context too. I'm not going to get worked up by people trying to deplatform Alex Jones or Joe Rogan because I don't have a platform. Well, somebody will do that to you. I hope that someday I have a $200 million platform for somebody to try to take away from me. If they succeed in taking it away from me, I'll just have to comfort myself with the money.
Well, with First Amendment, we have the right to speak, but we don't have the right to platforms. I can't just walk into New York Times and hand them a story and say, you have to run this.
No.
And
Freedom
so
of the press.
I don't understand where this is coming from. Like, we have the right to, even with public broadcast, imagine if every single person had the right to publish anything they want on public broadcast. Well, like, we would never get the news.
Freedom of the press is the freedom for the owner of the literal printing press to make capitalist decisions. It's not some deeply ingrained right that every American enjoys to express themselves. It's freedom for the owner of the printing press to make free business decisions about what he publishes.
Yep.
And
now the fourth estate and all of that was wrapped up into it is wrapped up into the furtherance of the First Amendment and the right to political speech.
Yes.
So, and the right to accountability, but that also doesn't guarantee the right to the platform.
I do try to live by the words of one of the great but forgotten newspaper publishers of the original progressive era, who published many of the muckrakers, which was a newspaper's got to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. And so that's really what it comes down to. And if your biggest concern is whether or not Joe Rogan gets to keep a $200 million platform, you're too comfortable. You need some affliction.
I agree.
And I mean, that's really where it comes down to. We have this sort of idea of freedom of speech that comes down to we have to stand back and shut up and let Nazis talk. Because if you look at what people are saying online to people standing up for queer folks, that's what they're being told, that they're somehow threatening the free speech of others,
when they simply are practicing free speech themselves. You have the right to free speech, but you're not free from the response to that speech.
Exactly.
You have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to the shielding.
People have the right to...
I can't just walk into work tomorrow and say, like, let's say I worked at a company and my boss was Sharon. I can't walk into work tomorrow and say, fuck Sharon, and then print off a bunch of materials talking about how Sharon is a cunt, and then expect to keep my job at that workplace. You know, I can say that was my political speech against capitalism, and it would be pretty cool if I could keep my job after that. But
now,
you know, there is a difference.
I would argue that while that might be uncalled for, if Sharon really fires you for calling her a cunt, she's just proving you right.
That's true. But I have the right, you know, I can't get arrested for saying fuck Sharon, right? I'm not going to get jailed for it, but there might be consequences. I could get reprimanded at my work, or I could lose my job. There's always, when there's freedom, it means that we're not going to get round up and arrested. It doesn't mean that there's no societal or cultural or personal consequences for what you say. It's not a shielding from consequences. It's the right to say it. And so if you're going around and, you know, I don't know, social media, there's some gray zones there, but I think that you can fight for some freedom of speech on social media, but then there's also nuance to this conversation, because calling for an entire group of people to die or be murdered isn't necessarily considered free speech.
No. And
actually, there's a ton of precedent against it. Just like when they were burning crosses in yards across from, I can't remember the name of that court case, but that's one of the Supreme Court cases. And the neo-Nazis were arguing, we have the right to burn the cross. It's a symbolism of, of our beliefs. Well, it's not. It's considered hate speech. It's considered inciting violence against a particular group. And in that case, it was determined, and this was in the 90s, neo-Nazis have been around a while, It was determined that inciting violence against a particular group is considered incitement and it's not protected speech. So if Libs of TikTok is going and saying to blow up a damn hospital, or they're inciting
No.
violence is not a
And
protected speech.
and this is the trouble, as you get into the lone wolf language, where people will blame mental health and poor economic conditions and
Those
bullies
crazy
at
whores.
school,
Yeah.
and all to deny that a Nazi terrorist who shoots up a drag show is a Nazi terrorist, or that, or people will talk about the crime in a neighborhood to explain away a mass shooting near a gay neighborhood after people have been talking about groomers
Right.
in social media. And it's just, no,
But they
that's
know
terrible.
at the end of the day, they know exactly what they're doing.
They do, I think. And that's the problem.
And that's to call for that to be, for the longest time the right wing has made calls. Their biggest bellwether and one of the biggest bells that they ring is, we have the right to freedom of speech. We have the right to the freedom of religion. And so if we want to deny someone access into our store because they're a Jew, or because they're of a certain color, or because they're of a religion that we don't like, whether it be Jewish, Muslim, or heck, another denomination of Christianity, because
And
that
now,
happens, then we want to, we're Protestants, so we want to deny Catholics. You're
and
getting,
suddenly, and so
Alito was just talking about this the other
you're
day, and
getting,
erasing 30 years of precedence
you're,
in his
you're,
interpretation. I was
you're
like,
you're
saying,
getting into the discussion of bringing back Jim Crow in Nuremberg.
that's right. That's
And
right.
because, I mean, when you talk about discriminating against gay people because you're Christian, there's a thin line between discriminating against gay people because you're Christian and discriminating against Jews because they're not Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And anti-Semitic mythology associates queerness with Jewish influence in all sorts of malign ways. And this shouldn't be forgotten. Same with communism.
Yeah. I mean, we could go back to McCarthyism with this type of
Communism
language as well.
communism is frequently a dog whistle about Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Elites is frequently a dog whistle about Jews. Increasingly, both are also dog whistles about queer people. And it's the life, and that's the world that we're living in. And so when I see people talk
But we're
about
beyond dog whistles, Chris. They're not even whistling anymore.
when I see people talk about free speech without acknowledging all these things, I get skeptical fast.
Same.
And I want to thank you. I keep saying I want to wrap up, and then I keep
Okay,
going.
sorry. I will let you.
No, I'm enjoying the show. I want to make sure to stop.
I keep adding something extra
Well,
because
I do the same thing. So
the
it's
last talk we just had about the freedom, or the distinction between freedom of speech and it really boils down to one thing, and this is the last thing I'll say.
yeah,
It boils down to, are you calling for freedoms and liberty for all, or
yeah,
are you asking for the freedom to oppress
some
and control others' behavior?
exactly. And when you're talking about denying your right to deny something to somebody else, why do you feel like you need that right?
Mm-hmm. That's not a right. That's not enshrined anywhere. You don't get to choose that people shouldn't be gay. And my right is my religion tells me that I believe that all, we should go out and kill every single badger in the country because all badgers are evil. You know what I mean? Like, what?
Well,
At that point, murdering badgers is like is that
well,
is that freedom? What is the freedom? You're putting your beliefs on another living organism and eradicating them because that's what your belief system is.
And then I feel fortunate sometimes that I can say, well, in my religion, we took over the city of Munster and we told all the folks whose marriages had been arranged by their families, we're abolishing the family, live with who you want. And sadly, that only lasted for a couple of years before they threw us out again. But I just think I think it's interesting that when people say that their right involves policing someone else, they're actually talking about their social authority, not human rights at all.
Right.
They're talking about their position in the social order as opposed to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank you again, Zeynab. I really appreciate you talking to me tonight.
Bye, Chris.
Goodbye.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. I appreciate everyone for joining us. Thank you all. You all have a great night too. And we'll tweet at you.
Bye.